What just happened in the Middle East should terrify anyone with a functioning brain, because this is no longer a conventional exchange of missiles, drones, and political messaging. This is now a live fire confrontation moving directly across the fault line of nuclear infrastructure, and once a war crosses that line, the margin for error does not shrink gradually, it collapses. In a matter of hours, we saw reports of a strike on Natanz, one of the most sensitive pillars of Iran's nuclear program, followed by an Iranian missile attack in the vicinity of Dimona, the long-whispered heart of Israel's undeclared nuclear weapons architecture. If you think this is just another round of symbolic retaliation, you are not paying attention. This is escalation at the level where one bad calculation, one failed interceptor, one bunker buster penetrating deeper than intended, or one missile landing a few hundred meters closer to a reactor can produce consequences no air defense system on Earth can contain. The public is being told to focus on who fired first, who retaliated second, and whose press office is spinning harder. That is noise. The reality is much more dangerous. The reality is that both sides are now operating in a battle space where the difference between a military strike and a regional radiological emergency may be measured in seconds, meters, and luck. Start with Natanz, because this is where the strategic logic becomes brutally clear. Natanz is not some decorative piece of Iran's nuclear network. It is central terrain. It has long been understood as one of the core sites in Iran's enrichment infrastructure, and everybody involved in this conflict knows exactly what that means. You do not strike a place like that by accident. You do not hit it for symbolism alone. You hit it because you are trying to degrade capability, impose strategic paralysis, send deterrent messaging, and possibly force a decision cycle inside Tehran under maximum stress. But there is another side to that equation that too many television analysts either do not understand or are too cowardly to say out loud. When you strike a protected, hardened, high-sensitivity nuclear facility, you are not just attacking infrastructure. You are gambling with containment, with industrial integrity, with emergency response, with backup power, with subterranean systems the public never sees, and most journalists could not identify on a diagram if their lives depended on it. Governments immediately rushed to reassure everyone that there had been no radioactive leakage, no danger to local residents, no abnormal readings. Fine, but stop and think about what such a statement actually means. It means the first political priority after the strike was not victory, not deterrence, not even damage assessment in the normal sense. It was containment reassurance. That alone tells you how close the event already was to a threshold nobody wants to admit exists. And this is where language matters, because the official language coming out of military and political establishments is always calibrated. When one side says it is not aware of a strike rather than denying involvement, that is not a trivial phrasing issue. That is operational ambiguity. It creates maneuver space. It preserves deniability. It allows allies to coordinate narratives without formally aligning legal responsibility. It keeps adversaries guessing about command chains, rules of engagement, and escalation ladders. People hear those phrases and think they are bureaucratic filler. They are not. In crisis signaling, every word is chosen the way artillery coordinates are chosen, for effect. If Israel wanted to openly own a strike, it knows how to do that. If Washington wanted to separate itself cleanly from an operation, it also knows how to do that. So when the public receives carefully measured ambiguity instead of blunt clarity, that is itself information. It means the actors involved want the military effect of the operation without fully accepting the political burden of attribution. Stay with that thought, because once you understand how ambiguity is being weaponized, the strike near Dimona stops looking like a simple revenge strike and starts looking like a message written in the only language both sides still believe the other will understand. Then came the Iranian response in the vicinity of Dimona, and this is where the entire conflict moved from dangerous to historically reckless. Dimona is the center of gravity no one officially discusses, while everyone strategically acknowledges. For decades, Israel's policy of nuclear ambiguity has rested on a structure of silence around that location. There are things states say publicly, and there are things states build entire defense doctrines around without ever saying them at all. Dimona belongs in the second category. So when missiles start landing in the surrounding area, this is not just retaliation in a geographic sense. It is retaliatory signaling against the most sensitive nerve center in the Israeli deterrence ecosystem. Tehran does not need to physically breach the core of the facility to make its point. It only needs to demonstrate reach, persistence, and the possibility of repeated penetration under wartime conditions. That is enough to force Israeli planners into a new threat calculus. Because now the question is no longer, can Iran target the area? That question has been answered. The question becomes, how many projectiles can be stopped during a multi-axis saturation attack under sustained pressure over time while the public is panicking and political leaders are promising control they may not actually possess? That is a far uglier question, and it has no comfortable answer. The details of casualties and structural damage matter here, but not just for humanitarian reasons. They matter because they reveal the operational truth behind the rhetoric of invulnerability. Civilian buildings were hit. Emergency services responded across multiple sites. Children were wounded. People were pulled from damaged structures. Psychological trauma spread through the population along with the shrapnel. Strip away every flag and every slogan, and this is what remains. When missiles get through, the human body absorbs the lie of total defense. States invest enormous resources in anti-missile architecture because it buys time, reduces casualties, and strengthens deterrence. But missile defense is not magic. It is a probability game. Every layered system has a leakage rate. Every interceptor inventory has a depletion curve. Every radar picture can be complicated by timing, trajectory, decoys, salvo size, and cumulative operational stress. The moment a projectile lands near one of the most heavily protected strategic zones in the country, the myth of impenetrability starts to crack. And once that myth cracks, adversaries revise their attack models. They do not see failure as a one-off. They see proof of concept. They ask themselves what happens if they scale it, diversify it, time it differently, or coordinate it with other fronts. That is why one successful strike near a critical site is never just one successful strike. It is a rehearsal under combat conditions, and every planner in the region knows it. But if you think the most alarming development was the exchange involving Natanz and Dimona, you still have not reached the center of the nightmare. The real red line may have been crossed days earlier near Bushehr, and far too few people grasp what that implies. Bushehr is not an enrichment complex buried in strategic ambiguity. It is Iran's only operating nuclear power plant. That distinction changes everything. A functioning reactor is not just politically sensitive infrastructure. It is an active radiological environment with fuel, with systems, with stored material, with downstream consequences that do not care about military intentions. Reports indicated that a projectile landed roughly 350 meters from the reactor complex and destroyed a nearby structure. Read that distance again and let it settle in. 350 meters. In ordinary urban war, that is a near miss. In the context of an operating nuclear power facility, that is a warning from physics, not from diplomacy, because the issue is not whether the reactor was directly hit on that occasion. The issue is that the battle space has now come close enough to an operating reactor that the impossible can no longer honestly be called impossible. The public is told not to worry because the worst case did not happen this time. That is exactly the kind of complacent nonsense that precedes disaster. Now widen the frame, because Bushehr is not only about Iran. If a reactor incident occurs there, the consequences do not stop at the Iranian coastline like a customs checkpoint. This is the Persian Gulf. Water, wind, desalination, shipping, energy infrastructure, population centers, and regional interdependence all converge in this space. A serious radiological event at Bushehr would not be an Iranian domestic problem. It would become a transnational crisis affecting water systems, public health, regional trade, food security, emergency management, and interstate politics across multiple Gulf states. Desalination plants depend on the Gulf. Civilian populations depend on desalination plants. That means a radiological contamination event in the Gulf is not just a military tragedy or an environmental scandal. It is a strategic shock to the life support systems of entire countries. And yet the world is acting as if the central concern is still headline management. It is astonishing. Political leaders are talking like campaign spokesmen, while military forces are maneuvering around facilities that could poison the regional environment if struck directly. Keep watching this pattern because it reveals the deepest pathology of modern crisis management. Governments are prepared for escalation theatrics, but not for the material consequences of the escalatory ecosystem they themselves are creating. There is another deeply unsettling aspect to the Bushehr incident, and it is one of the few pieces of this puzzle that should make everyone pause before jumping to the usual scripted conclusions. Attribution remains murky. That matters. People reflexively assume every strike near Iranian strategic infrastructure must have originated from Israel, the United States, or some coordinated covert architecture linked to them. Maybe, but maybe not. Trajectory analysis and debris patterns can tell a much more complicated story. If the evidence suggests an incoming path inconsistent with the expected direction of an external attack, then suddenly you have to confront possibilities few governments like to admit in wartime: malfunction, misfire, internal launch error, weapons handling failure, misidentification, or some classified system behaving in ways the operators did not intend. That possibility does not make the situation less dangerous. It makes it more dangerous because accidental escalation around nuclear infrastructure is in some ways even more destabilizing than deliberate escalation. A deliberate strike at least has political logic, command responsibility, and a signaling framework attached to it. An accident introduces chaos, misinterpretation, and the very real possibility that one state retaliates for an act the other state did not actually commit. History is full of wars worsened by misunderstanding. Add nuclear-sensitive terrain to that formula, and the danger multiplies. Meanwhile, the battlefield has continued to expand horizontally and vertically. Additional sites linked to Iranian military research and development have reportedly been struck, including locations associated with missile production and the kind of dual-use scientific activity that always sits in the gray zone between civilian cover and strategic intent. This matters because wars like this are never just about what gets hit. They are about what kind of future capability is being denied. Laboratories, fabrication nodes, test facilities, command sites, storage depots, tunnel access points, and industrial university complexes are all part of a single military technological organism. Destroying one lab is not just removing one building, it is interrupting design cycles, talent concentration, procurement chains, and technical continuity. But here again, the danger is not one-sided. If the attacking side believes that broad infrastructure degradation will produce strategic collapse, and the defending side demonstrates it can absorb punishment while still retaliating, then both sides become trapped in a vicious logic. The attacker thinks it must hit harder because the desired collapse has not yet materialized. The defender thinks it must retaliate more dramatically because endurance itself is now the political message. That is how wars become self-accelerating systems. And when self-accelerating systems operate near nuclear facilities, missile bases, and population centers, you are no longer in the realm of manageable signaling. You are in the realm of cascading risk. Now add one more layer: range. Once missiles begin demonstrating reach beyond previously declared limits, the theater changes even if the map does not. If a state has publicly signaled one range threshold and then operational events suggest a greater one, every capital inside that newly implied radius starts recalculating. That is not speculation. That is standard strategic behavior. Deterrence is built not only on what is said, but on what is proven under wartime conditions. So, if the war is already showing that ballistic systems can threaten targets at much greater distances than many policymakers had comfortably assumed, then the audience for this conflict immediately expands. What was sold as a regional confrontation begins to cast a shadow over Europe, over maritime routes, over expeditionary bases, over alliance politics, over force posture, over missile defense inventories, far from the immediate theater. This is the part most casual observers miss. They think escalation is only escalation when another country is directly hit. Wrong. Escalation also occurs when the demonstrated military envelope expands and forces new actors to consider themselves potential stakeholders, potential targets, or potential interveners. And once that happens, crisis management becomes exponentially harder because more governments enter the equation carrying their own red lines, domestic politics, intelligence assessments, and appetite for risk. Inside Israel, the impact of repeated salvos on civilian zones exposes another hard truth. A society can be highly militarized, highly disciplined, technologically advanced, and still strategically vulnerable when conflict moves into a prolonged missile exchange. Kindergartens are damaged. Residential blocks are torn open. Civilians are injured while moving to shelters. Entire municipalities shift into emergency footing. That is not just tragedy, it is pressure, strategic pressure, pressure on the public, on reserve systems, on local governance, on legitimacy, on the promise that superior intelligence and superior air defense can keep the home front fundamentally secure. No state can absorb that kind of stress indefinitely without political consequences, and Tehran understands this, just as Israel understands that sustained degradation of Iranian infrastructure imposes pressure inside Iran. Both sides are trying to shape the adversary's internal endurance. Both are trying to manufacture the moment when the other side's leadership blinks first. But if neither side blinks, then the exchange continues until some other variable intervenes. External diplomacy, resource exhaustion, command rupture, or catastrophic miscalculation. And if you are waiting for the adults in the international system to define a clear off-ramp, you may be waiting a very long time. That ultimately is the most damning fact in this entire picture. There is no visible end state being articulated with any seriousness, not by the combatants, not by their patrons, not by the so-called responsible stakeholders who issue ritual statements about restraint while arming, signaling, maneuvering, and posturing all around the conflict. What are the termination conditions? What exact strategic objective, if achieved tomorrow, would cause the strikes to stop? What threshold of damage, deterrence, humiliation, retaliation, or restoration would be enough? Nobody is saying. And when governments wage war without publicly intelligible termination logic, the battlefield itself begins setting the terms. Then events drive policy instead of policy driving events. Then a missile landing near a reactor becomes not an aberration but a waypoint. Then a strike near an undeclared nuclear hub becomes not unthinkable but precedent. Then every successful interception is treated as proof of stability, even though it may only be postponing the one failure that changes history. And that is where this story turns from alarming to unforgivable, because every actor involved can see the edge and yet continues to walk toward it anyway. So let's strip this down to its essence. Natanz was hit. The area around Dimona was hit. Bushehr was nearly drawn into the line of fire. Civilian areas are taking damage. Missile defenses are leaking. Strategic ambiguity is being used as a weapon. Range assumptions are shifting. Nuclear adjacent red lines are being tested in real time. And still the world talks about this as though it were just another exchange in an already chaotic region. No. This is what late-stage escalation looks like before the truly irreversible event occurs. The lesson is not that catastrophe has already happened. The lesson is that the system is now operating in a way that makes catastrophe increasingly plausible. And once a war reaches that point, the most dangerous phrase in the world becomes, "We got through this round." Because one day, if this continues, they won't. And what comes next is the part almost nobody is prepared to face. And here is the part that should keep every military planner, every diplomat, and every civilian living anywhere near this arc of conflict awake at night. Once nuclear adjacent targets become normalized inside a retaliation cycle, the political taboo erodes faster than the military one. That is how strategic insanity becomes routine. The first time a strike lands near a facility like Natanz or Dimona, the world gasps. The second time, officials issue statements. The third time, analysts start talking about patterns, thresholds, and acceptable risk. That is the corruption of judgment war produces. People begin treating survival as proof of stability, when in fact survival may only be evidence that catastrophe has been delayed by chance. Let me be clear, chance is not strategy, luck is not deterrence, and no serious state should ever build its security assumptions around the hope that the next missile will miss by another 300 meters. What makes this even more reckless is that both sides are now trapped inside their own narratives. Israel has spent years presenting itself as capable of preemption, escalation, dominance, and technical superiority. Iran has spent years presenting itself as resilient, defiant, and capable of imposing costs across multiple fronts. Once those narratives harden, leaders do not simply manage a war. They become prisoners of the image they have sold to their own people and to the world. If Israel eases off without imposing visible strategic damage, it risks looking vulnerable. If Iran absorbs blow after blow without dramatic retaliation, it risks looking hollow. That is why conflicts like this become so dangerous. They stop being governed solely by battlefield logic and start being driven by political ego, ideological posture, and the fear of appearing weak. And when image management merges with missile warfare around nuclear infrastructure, you are looking at a formula for disaster, not deterrence. Now think about what the public is not being told. Emergency planning for a radiological incident is not improvised overnight. It requires doctrine, drills, decontamination capacity, hospital surge capability, iodine distribution planning, evacuation route control, atmospheric monitoring, water safety analysis, and cross-border coordination. Does anyone seriously believe the region is politically prepared for that level of coordinated response right now? Of course not. The same governments that cannot agree on the language of de-escalation are somehow supposed to cooperate under the pressure of contamination spread, civilian panic, and economic shock. That is fantasy. And that means the consequences of one major failure would not just be physical, they would be administrative, medical, political, and psychological all at once. But if you thought that was the end of the danger, it only gets worse from here. Because the battlefield is no longer confined to the immediate exchange between Israel and Iran, Hezbollah remains active. Regional airspace is saturated. Maritime routes are under pressure. American forces are in the picture. Russian personnel are connected to infrastructure inside Iran. Gulf states are watching their own vulnerabilities with growing alarm. Every one of these actors introduces another trigger, another misread signal, another pathway for escalation beyond the control of the two principal combatants. This is how regional wars become systemic crises, not necessarily through one deliberate grand decision, but through cumulative interactions nobody can fully control once the machinery is in motion. A drone crosses the wrong sector. A missile defense radar misclassifies a track. A contractor is killed. A foreign officer is caught in the blast radius of a strike. Suddenly, the war is no longer about the original exchange at all. It has mutated. And that is why the central question is not who can claim the next tactical success. The central question is who is willing to stop before the strategic environment collapses under the weight of its own momentum. Because if that answer is nobody, then this war will keep grinding forward until physics, not politics, imposes the final verdict. One direct hit too close to a reactor core, one breach of spent fuel storage, one cascading failure in containment, one missile that slips through where everyone assumed interception was guaranteed. That is all it takes, not 10 disasters, one event to transform a brutal regional conflict into a generational calamity. So when you hear officials speak in calm tones about proportionality, precision, and controlled escalation, understand what you are really hearing. You are hearing men in suits trying to persuade you that fire can be directed after it has already spread into the ammunition dump. The reality is much harsher. The war has entered a zone where every additional strike against strategic infrastructure carries consequences far beyond the target list, and unless somebody imposes a genuine off-ramp soon, the next headline will not be about deterrence, retaliation, or military signaling. It will be about the moment everyone realized they had mistaken proximity to disaster for control over it.